All right, everybody. You guys ready to start? Get started. Good. All right, today I have to admit the topic's kind of, at least for me, a little dry, and I apologize for that. But it's stuff that we need to go through as we're thinking about what the U.S. Constitution is. It doesn't have to be dry. It's just there's so many mechanical aspects to it that I want us to think about. So I want to start off by talking just briefly about the nature of the republic at the time of the founding. So when America is founded, and we define the founding between roughly February of 1761 up until about Thomas Jefferson's administration. At the time of the early founding, there was a question about what body of laws would govern what would become the United States. And there are a number of different ways that people could approach it. But John Dickinson, who's one of the most famous and most interesting of the American founders, but he's one that most people have forgotten, unfortunately. John Dickinson came up with this body of laws that he wrote that were called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were fairly weak. They put almost all power into the hands of Congress without there being any real checks and balances. But they weren't terrible either. They actually did some very good things, and they were fairly effective. But he writes them in 1777. They get revised, and they are fully implemented as the first Constitution of the United States in 1781. Maryland is the last of the states to ratify it. But so a lot of times you'll see people talk about the Articles of Confederation from 1781 to 1788. They actually went into effect in 1777. So even though not everybody had agreed to it, it's what everybody had agreed to, if that makes sense, by at least a kind of actual consent, if not a written consent. So the Articles did three things that were very important and very good. Number one, they kept the United States together. So it's very typical after a revolution in most countries to have a kind of reaction in which the country falls apart. In fact, revolutions almost always work to the extent that they destabilize countries, even when they're good revolutions. And they tend to devolve into further revolutions and further civil wars. That did not happen with the United States. We had violence. The United States has rarely been without its violence. We almost have always been violent in one way or another as a people, but it wasn't excessive violence in any way. And so we could say, number one, the Articles of Confederation, if we want to give three cheers for them, cheer number one would be that they actually did keep us together in some way. The second cheer would be related to the first one, and that is we would say that it allowed for the economy, for the most part, to work and for us to have free trade between the states. Not completely. You had some states that were acting up and getting haughty, but for the most part, the economy continued to function. Not perfectly, but it did function under the Articles of Confederation. Now, this may seem like faint praise, but again, it is very rare coming out of a revolution to have a stable economy, and yet we have a relatively stable economy. The third cheer is the biggest one. And this is the one that's also most impressive, and it's one you all know, even if you haven't necessarily thought about it in any recent moment. We beat the British, and we beat the British with the Articles of Confederation. So we defeated the largest empire the world had ever seen under the Articles of Confederation. And I bring up these 3 points because a lot of times, especially at a place like Hillsdale, where we treat, and justly so, but we treat the Constitution as essentially holy scripture. And again, I'm all in, well, okay, it's not up there with Scripture, but it's still really, 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 really good. We tend to think, well, the Constitution is great, and therefore everything else must have been terrible. And so the Articles of Confederation we kind of dismiss, but we shouldn't. They had some very good things about them. And if nothing else, we were unified and we were able to defeat the British under them. But there had been a call, I think I had this on the board, as early as 1780, there had been a call to revise the Articles of Confederation. So even before they're officially ratified, there was an attempt to get a new constitution in, led by a group of people that we call the Continentalists, and that's because that's what they called themselves. But they called themselves the Continentalists, and they were mostly Alexander Hamilton and his friends. but they are in favor of a much stronger national government. They continue to make that call throughout the 1780s. And then in 1786, the U.S. finally decides that it needs to have some kind of convention. The convention is called for the summer of 1787, and it is called to revise the Articles of Confederation. Nothing more than that, only to revise them. And that's where we end up for today. We get to the Constitutional Convention, 1787. It begins to meet right at the very end of May of 1787, bless you, and it will continue to meet through September 17th of 1787. So that whole summer is really the summer of the Constitutional Convention, and there's a lot they have to debate. I'm gonna bring the debates in on Monday. I didn't have time to get this ready, and I've got a handout for you guys. We're going to talk about one of the most important issues of the time, slavery, and think about slavery and what it meant to the founding, because it's one of those, it's a key issue, not just for us looking back, but it was a key issue for them as well, and kind of a cultural marker of who was on what side. So I've got some handouts and things, and we'll talk about that more. But I do want you to know that there were very serious debates going on all throughout the entire summer, not just about things like slavery, but whether or not we would have a powerful Congress or we'd have a powerful presidency or whatever it may be. This came about, these debates were really important in shaping, and especially in creating a kind of discourse, in shaping who and what we are as a people, and those debates then will shape the whole future of American history. You guys have, you read for today, at least I had asked you to read the Federalist Papers and to read those anti-Federalist papers. The debates, reading the Federalist Papers, they're great, so don't get me wrong, and don't take what I say wrong, but reading the Federalist Papers is, you're reading newspaper editorials, you're reading a very sanitized version of the debates. When you read the actual debates, it's not as pretty at all. It's very, very, very messy, and there's a lot of anger on the floor. So how many in here have actually been to where the Constitution was written? How many people have been in? Anybody in here at all?
Wait, that's in Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia, yeah. Oh, you remember it by the city. Very good, very good. So 3 of you. All right. It's a small room where they met. It's not much bigger than this room right here, and this is back when, I just want you to visualize it. This is back when men, of course, wore multiple layers of wool clothing. It's the summer in Philadelphia. It was one of the hottest summers on record and one of the most humid summers on record. It's a room this size with 55 men in it debating. And I often think about that because they'll say things like, and as we refer to our august president, and George Washington was the president of the convention, and they say things like that, they're standing at best about where Tracy or Annie is to me, right? So it's not, we think of these, Congress, they get up and they're way away and then they can give these grand, eloquent speeches. No, these are guys who don't wear deodorant because it hasn't been invented yet. They're in a very small, humid room. They're wearing multiple layers of clothing, and they're arguing fiercely with one another. One of my favorite, when you go through Madison's notes, and maybe I'll read this to you on Monday, but one of my favorite moments, Madison is recording a speech by Luther Martin, not Martin Luther, but Luther Martin, who was a representative from Maryland. And he said, he writes down about 2 lines, and then he says, and from here, Luther Martin gave a 6-hour drunken speech. And that's all he wrote. So he didn't record anything down. Well, imagine if you're 55 men in this room and one of us is drunk. Well, you would think you would take care of it. It just seems to be an exaggeration. And how did he stay drunk for 6 hours? Did you come that loaded at 7 a.m? And there are questions you got to ask. It's like, okay, how exact is this? But that's what they say, right? And those are what the notes are. And so remember that there are tensions. There are very high tensions. They have windows, but they keep the windows heavily curtained. They put up big velvet curtains because they don't want the press listening in. So you can imagine that you're in this room where you're all together and there's no circulation at all, and everybody's still. So pretty amazing stuff. And you've got to give these guys credit for putting up with this for all summer and dealing with it. But anyway, I just wanted to give you a sense of what those debates are like. So when the debates actually happen, and we'll go over them in actuality on Monday, as I said, but I want you to remember what we talked about the other day, and that is this division that we have is a division between these three parts of the human person. There's the head, and then the soul or the heart, and the stomach. And it's related to, the head is directly related to the executive, to the monarchical, the soul is related to the aristocratic, and the stomach is related to the democratic. We split this up so that we have this division of powers between the executive branch, the presidency, which represents our rational ability, our intellect. We have the House of Representatives, which represents our passions. And then originally, at least, we had two aristocratic bodies. We had the Senate, which is no longer aristocratic. That's now democratic. That's been moved into this category since 1907 because of the amendment that has direct election of senators. But the Supreme Court remains as this kind of aristocratic body. And when we think about all of this, imagine how much say do any one of us have in this. We have almost zero say in the presidency. We have almost zero say in the Senate or the Supreme Court, Senate originally. And in the House, we get one vote for one member of the House. So it should be very clear, just by thinking about this, we are not, as Americans, and we never have been a democracy. We have always been a republic from the very beginning. Now, the history of America is the history of democratization. That is clear. We have become more and more and more democratic ever since the founding of the Constitution. But we are not a democratic power, at least originally, we're not a democratic power. We are a Republican power with one democratic element within it. And yet, again, that becomes that democracy becomes the essential point to who and what we are. So this is where I'm afraid this is going to be a little dry, but I want us to go through the parts of the Constitution and break things down. And I would like you to know, and I did not talk to Anna about this, but I'd be pretty surprised if she would disagree with this. I would like you to be able to identify the 7 articles of the Constitution. So I don't think there are parts of it that you have to know specifically. I mean, I'll give you some parts that you should know. I don't think you have to, for example, memorize Article 1 or Article 2 or Article 3, but I do want you to know what each of the articles deals with. So let's just go through those quickly, and then we'll think about the checks and balances. So Article 1 deals specifically with the Senate and the House. So this is Congress, right? Article 1 is Congress. It deals with the rules of Congress, what Congress can and can't do, what it should and should not do. So Article 1 is Congress. Article 2, and we'll spend some time with Article 2 in a moment. In fact, when I ask if someone would read it, I would appreciate it. We're going to go through the whole article, but we have Article 2, the executive. So everything the president can and can't do, should and shouldn't do. Article 3 is the Supreme Court. Not very long, and we can talk about that if we want, but it is the court of last resort. Only one. A judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, with inferior courts as Congress may establish from time to time. But then we get to the other articles, and these are a little bit more complicated. Article 4, and I put this word on the board for you. Article 4 is what's known as the principle of comity. And I'm sorry, my Kansas accent there. It sounds like I'm saying comedy. It's comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y. And it means reciprocity. So this deals with the way states deal with one another and how are they reciprocal with one another. So I'll give you an example from my childhood of this. So, and I think this is crazy, but of course as a kid I loved it, but I think as an adult now it's crazy. In Kansas, we got our driver's licenses at age 14. You go to driver's ed at age 13 and you get your license in 14. Still Kansas law. I looked it up the other day. I thought surely they've changed that, but no. And of course I was right there. Age 13, I went to driver's ed, and age 14 I had my license, and my mom was very loose and allowed me in a good way and allowed me to do whatever I wanted. So I drove like mad all the time. But I think that's crazy now, looking back at that. And what happens? because of comedy, if I were to have driven to Oklahoma, in Oklahoma you have to be 16, could Oklahoma arrest me for being an underage driver? They can't, actually. That's comedy. Comedy says that you respect the laws of one state and another. So now this becomes problematic because, well, you can imagine. What's another example? You get married in one state. My wife and I got married in Texas, and we flew then from Austin up to Idaho. We didn't have to get remarried in Idaho. The laws in Texas were good enough for Idaho. Right? This is what comedy is. So comedy allows for one state to be able to recognize that in another state. What are problems with that, though? And Annie, I saw you shaking your head. What are some problems with this? And feel free to speak. Catherine, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Legalization of certain things.
Yeah.
In certain states.
Yeah, like Colorado, where almost everything's legal. Yeah. Right, but when you go into Kansas, that's no longer legal, right, at all. And Kansas will definitely stop you for that, okay? So there's one. What's another one? And it's more for my generation than yours, but yeah.
Another one is the drinking age.
Yeah, drinking age is a big deal. Now I think every state is the same, right? But for a long time, they were really different. And people from, say, Ohio would drive up to Michigan to get beer because it was legal, right? And if you lived close to the border, you could do that, right? Well, think about marriage in particular, right? And this is not as big a deal for your generation as it was for mine. But let's say San Francisco allows gay marriage. But then you go to Kansas. Kansans aren't real hip on that, right? That's where it becomes really, and I'm not trying to make a point one way or the other, except to say that there can be problems with this, and it gets really complicated. So, but comedy is it's a very medieval system in a good way. Comedy is meant to recognize varieties of law forms and to give sanction to different forms of law. And you can have all kinds of different laws going on at the same time. We do that all the time when we drive across county or when we drive across state. Laws are constantly changing for us. I mean, for example, my wife and I have a family place in Colorado, and I would love to be able to hunt when I'm there, but you cannot take arms across Illinois. They will not allow you. It's an imprisonable fine. So I would have to drive all the way around Illinois to get my guns to Colorado, or just buy guns in Colorado, but I haven't done that. And there you have an issue of comedy. So even if I had a concealed carry weapon from Michigan, they're not going to give me the benefit of the doubt in Illinois. So even though by comedy they should, but they don't, and that can cause all kinds of problems. Anyway, my point here is not to show you the problems. I just want you to know what Article 4 is. And therefore, it's meant to be an article that allows essentially not only for the recognition of one state and another, but also to make sure that we don't have states erecting trade barriers against other states as well. And I do get, I'll be very personal here for a moment. I get so mad when you get taxed for Amazon, if you buy something from Amazon, because goods cross state lines, they're not supposed to be taxed. It's unconstitutional, but they are. And all kinds of localities get all kinds of taxes from things like that. But according to the Constitution, you really can't do that, but everybody does it anyway. Catherine.
Is it the Supreme Court that rules over disputes between states in that regard? Yes. It doesn't happen very often, interestingly enough. There aren't that many interstate disputes. Congress has tried to head things off by using the Commerce Clause as a way of regulating interstate commerce. I'm no constitutional historian, but my great friend Paul Marino, who is here, Dr. Marino, he teaches whole courses on this. So yeah, this is a huge question. Not one I am capable of talking about, but definitely huge, yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, so Article 5 basically allows for the Constitution to be changed because it is what is the amendment process. And obviously there can be amendments to the U.S. Constitution, as we know, and they're frequently, we go through periods where we have kind of spurts of amendments that come through. Article 6, so we're on page 156 now. Article 6 is historically very important, but doesn't matter as much now.
Article 6 said, and it was sometimes it's called the honorable amendment or the honorable article of the Constitution. It said that simply because we are leaving behind the Articles of Confederation, all the debt that had been accrued during the Articles of Confederation will be paid off under the U.S. Constitution. So simply because we change governments, we're not using that as an excuse to ignore our debts. And this is incredibly important for the integrity of an economic system and to make sure that foreign countries didn't think of us as just some fly-by-night third world power, which could happen, right? And we've had Brazil has reneged on debts before, Mexico's reneged on debts before, but the United States from the very beginning said, we're not going to do that. We're going to make sure that we live up to our debt. And then we get to Article 7. And Article 7 is a little tricky, and this is where it gets into the heart of what we're talking about today. Article 7 says that only 9 out of the 13 states need to agree to the Constitution for the Constitution to go into effect. Why would they have to do that? And what's the problem with that? Annie? Yeah.
I mean, states that are more states' rights oriented aren't going to ratify it, and if there's even one, then you can't ever unify.
Yeah.
And you just get stuck.
Can you think of one in particular in the colonial period that maybe?
I think Maryland.
Okay, Maryland has an interesting case.
It was Rhode Island.
Yeah, Rhode Island, right? Rhode Island did not even send a delegate to the Constitutional Convention because they did not in any way want to be seen as giving any consent to this thing at all. So what's the problem with this, especially from a kind of a moral or ethical standpoint? Yeah, Abby.
Well, we harp on consent to the governed, representation, all of these things, and so it seems inconsistent.
Yeah, just a little bit. So here we are talking about how we have to have the consent of the governed, but we're willing to put this thing on. And of course, Rhode Island's not going to be a part of it. So it would be a done deal from the beginning if we didn't do this. What did the Articles of Confederation say for a change? Yeah.
Everybody needed to.
It had to be unanimous,
Yes.
right, for any change to be made. Yeah. What's your name? Sorry.
Sam.
Sam, thanks.
I was going to say that I think when saying that only 9 out of the 13 states are needed, it also kind of says, if they're trying to keep this entire country unified, ignoring, the fact that some people are, wholeheartedly disagree with everything that's going on and just say, oh, you're part of the system now, whether you like it or not, because we all agree, and even if you don't,
right,
kind of screws up that.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And that, of course, was one of the great anti-federalist arguments as well. Talk about leaving yourself open in a debate, right, by doing that. So, yeah, absolutely. Annie?
Isn't it sort of still thinking for the common good in a way, though? Because you're talking about how, post-revolutionary governments, it's very unlikely for
very
it to end up in
unstable.
a stable
Yeah.
situation. And if they don't unify somehow, even if it means leaving some people behind for the moment, then let's end in a bloodbath potentially.
Yeah, so let's be historians for a moment. Did this work? Did the 9 out of 13 work?
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, right? It's amazing what we accept. And we have accepted it. And in large part, we've accepted it conventionally, not just legally. We've allowed it to become a part of our culture. And it's, now it's not a huge debate. Now, I didn't talk about this with the other class, but, okay, I do need to tell you this, and I should tell you that I should have told the other class too. But there are 4 laws that are passed that are called the organic laws. And I'll explain why this is important. The organic laws are, first of all, the Declaration of Independence, and then the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution, and finally the Bill of Rights. So these are the 4 organic laws, and it means they come out of common law. That's why they're called organic, because they come out of common law, and they all play on each other. But that means then that one replaces the other, but not fully. So the articles fulfill the Declaration, but don't overturn them. And the Constitution fulfills the Articles of Confederation, but doesn't necessarily overturn it. So this is, you guys are all too young to, in fact, I doubt if you were even born when this happened in the mid-90s, right? You wouldn't have been around yet. In the mid-1990s, there was a big debate in Canada of whether Quebec would secede or not from the rest of Canada. And they had a vote, and it was super close. But Canada voted to stay with Canada. Quebec voted to stay with Canada. But it was super close. I mean, it was... And the Articles of Confederation have a clause, I think it's 13, I'd have to double check that, but I think it's Article 13 of the Articles that says that at any point, Canada can join the Union without a vote. I mean, they just come in there, so the question was, since the Constitution never overturned that, and it never mentions Canada, so are the Articles, if there are 4 organic laws, are the Articles still in effect? And most people actually in the mid-90s agreed that if Saskatchewan or Alberta want to become part of the United States, they just would. That would just happen. And I mean, it was an interesting debate. Can you imagine if we had gotten all of Western Canada? That would have been kind of cool, actually. Sorry, I'm sounding like an imperialist, but that would have been kind of cool. But anyway, I mean, it was close there. And so my point here I want to bring up is simply that some of these things aren't always black and white. There's a lot of leeway in the way that these things, and a question like Canada, that's a fascinating question. Yeah, Annie.
Could I take us onto a tangent about Canada, or would you like to keep going?
Go for it. No, I'm fine.
If that were to happen, would Canada, was the deal that Canada would have just let them go if they had voted to go?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was in my lifetime, I've never seen a more serious debate about secession. Right? It was really close, and the tensions were very high. I mean, extremely high. And Scotland has had a vote too, where it barely stayed. And now that may change with Brexit, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, no, these are incredible questions, right, to think about. And think about how would we handle it if suddenly Alberta would we divide it into states? Would we make it a state? That's a big state if it came in as that's big. Their provinces are huge, right? They're like Texas size. So would we? Yeah, those would be important questions.
But they wouldn't, because when states tried to secede from this union,
it didn't seem like there was going to be force involved. So, yeah, it looked like it was going to happen, and it was going to be peaceable. Yeah.
So
Tell me your name again.
Jesse,
thank you.
Was the clause that they would become states or like U.S. territories?
Yeah, that would be an interesting question. If they would be states or U.S. territories, probably first territory. Wow. What if we had territorial governments again? That would be really... Yeah, I mean, this opens up a total... this is Pandora's box, right? What could happen? So, yeah. Anybody else have their hand up? Nope. Okay, anything else on this? And don't worry, you're not going to distract us too much. This is kind of fun. So, Catherine.
I have a previous question, just a clarification. Was the room you were talking about, was that Carpenter's Hall?
Yeah. Had you been there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, Carpenter's Hall. Yeah. Okay, well, let's get back to this. Let me just throw this out to you. I mean, we're talking. You guys are talking. It's great. What are some arguments? No. Before we do that, we need to break some things down. Sorry. Yeah, before we get into the arguments for and against. Let's break this down. So let's look at Article 1 for a moment. Okay, Article 1, dealing with Congress. What is it, and I hope you had a chance to read through this, what is it that Congress alone can do? What special powers does it have? Or what's reserved to it? Yeah, George.
Impeachment.
Okay, it can impeach, right? What a big topic right now. Huge topic. So it can impeach. How does that work?
I think it starts with the House, and I think it's a majority, and then it goes to the Senate, it's 2/3.
Yep, and it's got to be a trial, right? So in the House, it's a hearing. In the Senate, it's a trial. Okay, have we had it happen before?
I think so.
Yeah, we have. This is our 4th impeachment going on right now in U.S. history. Doesn't happen that often, but yeah, twice in my lifetime. That seems like enough, but yeah, we'll see what happens. Very interesting. Of course, they're impeaching someone who's not in office. That's an interesting thing as well. I tried to argue on Twitter last night. I thought that was unconstitutional, but The Twitter mob came after me. I didn't back down, but I think I lost. Anyway, okay, so what else? Yeah, Tracy.
Control money.
Critical, right? Absolutely critical. And which branch within Congress does money start? Do you remember?
The House.
Absolutely. Has to be the House. Senators cannot propose revenue-raising bills. They can only accept bills from the House. So they cannot in any way, shape, or form try and raise funding. And that means it's only the House. Why? Think about the scheme of things up there. Why does that matter? Yeah. What's your name?
Naomi.
Naomi.
Because
And your sister's Maria?
Yes.
Yes.
So the House is representative of the people, and at that time the Senate was representative of the states.
Yep.
If the people are being taxed,
Yep.
they should have a say in their money.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. So it's the people who are being taxed. It's a democratic function, and therefore it has to originate in the democratic body. Absolutely. Good. What else can it do? Annie?
I can't find this right now.
That's okay.
So I'm not, but do they also have the power to make treaties and stuff?
Yeah, the Senate does with the president, right? So there's a foreign policy element. The Senate ratifies treaties that the president makes. Yeah. And that's been, to me, that's been a good thing in U.S. history. It's been a very frustrating thing for other countries because the president will negotiate something and then Congress or the Senate will disagree with it and it won't go through. And I think other countries get very confused by that, how that can happen. It was also with Indians, it was a problem at times too, because the president negotiated treaties with the Indians and then the Senate either agreed or didn't. And there could be years difference between a president negotiating and the Senate agreeing to those kinds of things. But I think it's personally, I think it's a healthy division in the way that foreign policy works. There's still one other critical thing that only Congress can do, even though nobody takes this seriously anymore. But if we were to take the Constitution as is, it's the power to tax, and what's the other great power of government? Yeah.
The power to make laws.
Yeah, make laws, but this is a particular, and you're right, but this is a particular form of that. And it has to do with foreign policy. And Jen? Right?
It's Jesse.
Jesse, I'm sorry.
I don't think I have it, actually.
Okay. Yeah, Mason.
Declare wars.
Declare wars, absolutely. Right? And only Congress can do that. But that doesn't happen now, right? And I'll never forget, I mentioned this in the last class too. And you should all remember this. There was a moment where President Obama was on vacation on the beaches of Brazil, and he called in an air cordon around all of Libya. I mean, that's incredible power. You're on vacation. Yeah, I've got a whole other country that I'm going to close down their air lanes because, I mean, that's just stunning. And there is nothing in the Constitution that says the president has the right to do that at all. It is Congress who has the right to do that. But that's one of those questions. And since 1946, Congress has hardly done anything. We haven't been in a war since 1946. That was the last time we were officially in a war. Everything else has been a conflict because we can't declare it war because it wasn't declared by Congress. So it's a really interesting power. Mason.
Yeah, so I'm curious, because the reason that the president can do that is for the authorizations for the use of military force
right.
after 9/11, and those were passed by Congress. So does that make it roundabout constitutional? Or
that's the argument. The argument is that it is constitutional because Congress delegated its authority. The question is, does any one branch have the right to delegate its authority to another branch? And the founders seemed pretty clear. Well, they didn't think it would ever happen. I think this was one of the great mistakes. Slavery was obviously the great mistake of the founding, but the second great mistake was they thought that the branches would be so selfish of their power that they would never give away any aspect of their power. And so the question is, not that Congress has done it, can they do it? Even though they have. Right? Excuse me. Thank you for that. That's good. So keep that in mind. Annie.
Isn't the way the Constitution is supposed to work also that you only have powers that it says you do, so you can't?
Well, and we'll get to that. According to Articles 9 and 10 of the Bill of Rights, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's partly what those articles those amendments are about. Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, so let's look at Article number 2 then, and we see the Presidency of the United States. And would someone volunteer to read? Tracy, that'd be great.
Article 2?
Yeah, so starting on page 151.
The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and, together with the Vice President, chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislator thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. And they shall make a list of all the persons voted for, and of the number of votes for each, which list they shall sign and certify, and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the President. If such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if there be more than one who have such majority, and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for President. And if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the President. But in choosing the President, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice. In every case, after the choice of the President, the person having the greatest number of votes of the electors shall be the Vice President. But if there should remain 2 or more who have equal votes, the Senate shall choose from them by ballot the Vice President.
All right, Tracy, let's stop there. Well read. Thank you. Really well read, actually, especially considering how dry it is. But this isn't that dry right now because of what we just went through and what happened with the so-called insurrection and everything going on. I'm not trying to get political. I'm just thinking about how our history has been shaped by this. Who gets to be vice president according to this? Mason.
Second place.
Number 2, right? Well, let's just picture that for a moment. Can you imagine President Trump becoming Vice President Trump? With his president, I mean that's what this would be, right? With Biden as president. Okay, now and let's not get too political here. We're just thinking about it theoretically. That's pretty wild to think about. What mindset did these guys have? The founding, and we haven't done this since 1803. So, one of our first amendments was to get rid of this. Yeah, Abby.
Limited government, right? I think they know that number 2 will not have agreed with number 1.
Right, limited government, right? Does matter, right? It really matters. Well, the government's no big deal. Who cares who's running it, right? It's not going to affect much. So that's part of it. You're absolutely right, Sam.
It may have been like a unification and like kind of keeping things civil kind of thing, because if you have one party that if you lose, you're going to end up working for the other guy, then you're not going to
take that a little bit farther. What are they not expecting to happen? You just said it, but you said it indirectly.
I don't know.
They don't expect parties to develop.
Oh, yeah, I guess not. No. Yeah.
That's incredible, right? To think about that, they thought we could be without parties, and can we even imagine politics without parties? It's nearly impossible to think about. So that's what they thought, though. And why? Because it's a republic. This is the common good, right? You got to fight for the common good. You can't belong to a party and be for the common good. And we'll see that explicitly in George Washington when we get to him next week. But my gosh, what a different world this would be. Could we imagine no Republican or Democratic Party? That's incredible. And even right away, and one of the reasons I put feds and anti-feds lowercase is because they're really not parties. They're movements, not parties like we would recognize today in any way, shape, or form. But we're going to see that division immediately. The ink isn't even dried, and there are already parties forming, right? And yet they don't anticipate that. Annie?
I was just also going to say along those lines, of parties not forming, they didn't think that political leaders should promote themselves as as the heads of movements and ideas.
I'm the only one who can be president.
Yeah.
Right? No. There are a lot of people who could be. Yeah, absolutely. So they're against parties. They're against that kind of elitism, which is really interesting. Okay, so we'll just keep that in mind. So it's one reason I wanted Tracy to read that, but it also, think about how complicated this is. If A, then B. If B, then C. I mean, this is, no wonder our elections it's amazing our elections haven't been crazier than they are. Right? And we just came out of a crazy election, obviously, but the last one was 2000. Yeah, about the time you guys were coming into the world, right? That was the last time. That's not bad. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's enough in a lifetime. I've had enough of this craziness. But it isn't too often. It's only been 4 or 5 times in our history that we've had really weird elections. So that's stunning in and of itself. This generally works. Sam?
I'm gonna say this, and it's gonna sound stupid.
Not at all. Promise you.
It kind of sounds like they're reading off like game rules.
Yeah, like, no, that's not stupid at all.
If you do this, you
yes.
2 cards, and
yeah.
you proceed to space 5.
Exactly. Do not pass go.
Yeah.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And it's got to be written that way because there is some game theory involved in this. Right. Absolutely. No, I don't think that's stupid at all. Quite the opposite. Okay, let's jump forward on page 153. If you look there on line 8, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. That when is very important because it is unclear, to this day, it is unclear if the President is always Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy or he's only Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy and the militias when a war has been declared. And that's where, Mason, your point earlier, well, what about these delegation of powers? Well, do they really have the right to delegate those powers? That's an open... And you have one senator, again, not to get political, but there's only been one senator and one representative who have fought against this, and Senator Rand Paul and Thomas Massie. They're the only 2 who have been trying to uphold this. Nobody else cares, which is crazy in and of itself, but they just don't care. And yet those 2 guys keep dragging this out over and over again. But really, since 1946, no one's taken this seriously at all. It's been almost strictly with the president. Okay, Article 3 then, with the Supreme Court. Only one court. It says right at the beginning, top there of page 154, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as the Congress may have from time to time. There's no restriction on the number of justices, though by tradition it's 9. There's no restriction on how many lower courts there can be, though Congress has its own set. We've got our districts and everything. But one thing I want you to note, and I can't stress this enough, so I'll just state it as bluntly as possible, the Supreme Court is not given the power solely to determine what is constitutional and what is not. That is nowhere in Article 3. The Supreme Court, since the 1940s, has claimed that authority, and both the executive and the judicial and the congressional branch seem to acquiesce to that. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says that, and that's why, for example, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln completely ignored the Supreme Court and said that what they were doing was unconstitutional. And honestly, whether he was right about that argument or not is a different question. But as a president, he had the right to say another branch is being unconstitutional. And Congress has that right too. They just hardly ever exercise it anymore. In the 19th century, they exercised that all the time. One branch was always telling another branch, you guys are out of it. You're unconstitutional. This is completely out of order. But we haven't done that for a long time. It's been almost 100 years since we've done that last. So generally, we allow the Supreme Court. Okay, anybody have any questions on any of this, any of the mechanics of the Constitution? Obviously, we're not going into just tons of detail, but I want you to know those 7 articles and certainly those few things that we talked about with each of those, of the first, second, and third articles. Okay, let's do one last thing then, and we'll call it a day. So I do want you to think about some of the arguments that you had, and we'll talk more about this on Monday, but some of the arguments that we had between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I want to point out one argument in particular, which is Alexander Hamilton's argument. in which, and this was in Federalist number 1, but you had to kind of read into it if you didn't see it, because he goes through it in later Federalist papers far more than he does in this one. But in number 1, he talks about the necessity of giving energy to government. And what he means, a profound argument, whether he's right or not is a different question, but it's an interesting argument. The argument that he gives is that when you tell Congress it has the power to do this, this, and this, you have to give it the means to do it. That's what energy is. Energy is giving the means to the government to do something. And Hamilton says this is how you avoid big government. You avoid big government by defining exactly what it can and cannot do. Big government results, he says, when you give a power to one of the branches, but you don't tell them how it can be done, then they have to make stuff up. That's where dangerous government comes from. So Hamilton was not in favor of big government, but he was very in favor of energetic government. So keep that in mind as one of his main arguments. Okay, last thing. So let's look quickly at the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the greatest contribution of the Anti-Federalists. Right? They refused to go along with the idea that we could have a constitution without a Bill of Rights. So the agreement was, we will ratify the Constitution as long as you promise a Bill of Rights. And it took a couple of years. It wasn't, as you can see, until December, the middle of December of 1791, that the Federalists finally lived up to that. Yeah,
So
George.
Did the Articles have the Bill of Rights in?
No, they didn't. That's a great question, but no, they didn't. But the Bill of Rights was actually, the Articles contain common law rights within them in a way that the Constitution doesn't. So it had more of a common law feel to it than it. But we divide the Bill of Rights into 4 parts. And so I'd like you to know these 4 parts. So Amendments 1 through 3 are the common law rights in particular. So the right to establishment of religion, free speech, assembly, and so forth, the right to bear arms, the right not to have people living in our homes without our consent. And then you get to Amendments 4 and 5, and they're the property right amendments. How our property is protected against the U.S. government. And then 6, 7, and 8 are criminal rights. So what rights does someone accused have? And number 8 is always the most famous. No excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment. That's a big one. And then we get to these oddball things, Amendments 9 and 10, which basically say you either read the Constitution literally or you're not in the game. In other words, the only way we can have a Constitution is if those things that are not explicitly in it are given to the people or the states. Anybody know how many times Amendments 9 and 10 have been used in court cases? Once. It's really wild. It's part of having a constitution is you have to actually believe in it and uphold it. And for whatever reason, as Americans, there are certain parts of the Constitution we will never let be violated. There are other parts of the Constitution we've never cared about. And that's wild. Yeah, so, Jesse.
So what exactly are Articles 9 and 10?
Well, they're basically, we don't have a name for them. They're restrictive amendments. So they say, when you read the Constitution, you have to read it literally. You can't interpret it. There's no interpretation of the Constitution. It's either there or it's not. That's what they say. And if it's not there, it automatically defaults to either the people or to the states to have that.